Imagine for a second that you are running this like communal open source operating system on your computer, right?
Yeah.
And the code has been maintained by village consensus for literally centuries. It's super localized and is deeply intertwined with, your everyday routines.
Right.
But then almost overnight, this foreign tech conglomerate just bursts in and forcibly installs a rigid top-down corporate software onto your hardware.
And I'm guessing it doesn't run smoothly.
Oh, it's a disaster.
Yeah.
This new OS requires every single user to log their data directly with a central server. And the kicker is, the two systems literally cannot read each other's files.
Right.
The system friction is immediate, and it's catastrophic.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it's a total systemic overwrite. You're dealing with an architecture there that fundamentally changes how the individual relates to authority, to their community, and even to time itself. The original operating system isn't just, pushed aside. It's aggressively dismantled.
Exactly. And when those two massive societal architectures collide in the real world, you get the modern Islamic world.
You really do.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into a masterclass on this exact collision. We have an excerpt from Francis Robinson's introduction to Volume 5 of the New Cambridge History of Islam.
Which is such a fantastic text.
It really is.
Right.
And our mission today is to give you a shortcut to understanding the last 200 years of global history by unpacking the two massive intertwined forces that built the reality we see today.
Right, which are the crushing external weight of Western domination and then this fiery, deeply rooted internal drive for Islamic revival.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because to really understand the modern landscape, we have to start with the external pressure cooker.
Yeah, we have to look at the sheer mechanical speed and just the profound psychological shock of European expansion. I mean, the master narrative of the 19th and 20th centuries for this part of the world is this sudden, suffocating shadow of the West.
Right.
But the source makes a really crucial point here. The vulnerability actually started long before the total collapse. Robinson traces the actual beginning of the physical retreat all the way back to September 12th, 1683.
Wait, 1683, that's the gates of Vienna, right?
Yes, exactly. The Ottoman forces were ordered to retreat from Vienna, and, well, they never returned.
Wow.
So that was the start of this slow, multi-generational erosion on the margins of the Muslim world. But, it was a slow bleed. The symbolic shock to the absolute core of the system happens much later, in June 1798.
Oh, right. That is Napoleon Bonaparte invading Egypt.
Exactly. Which was the first time since the Crusades, really, that a European power had violently asserted itself right in the central Islamic lands.
It's right in the heart of it.
Yeah. And the French didn't just arrive with, superior artillery. They arrived with armies bearing the banners of the Enlightenment. Reason, nationalism, the modern state.
So it was an ideological invasion just as much as a military one.
Exactly.
And after Napoleon, that slow bleed just turns into a global avalanche. The text lays out this territorial sweep that is honestly staggering when you look at the dates.
Oh, it's incredibly fast.
Yeah. You have the Dutch systematically taking over island Southeast Asia, fighting this brutal process that they only really completed by the end of the Ace War in 1912.
Right.
And then you have the British in India, who defeated the last major independent Muslim power in Mysore in 1799.
Yeah.
And by 1858, they suppress a massive uprising, take total control of India, and keep the descendants of the mighty Mughal emperors as, virtual prisoners in Delhi.
It's wild. And at the exact same time, Tsarist Russia is sweeping south and east, just violently absorbing the Caucasus and Central Asia.
Yep.
Places like Dagestan, the Kazakh steppes, the Tajiks.
It's happening everywhere all at once.
It really is. The French are moving aggressively into North and West Africa. They take Algeria in 1830, then push into Tunisia and Morocco. By the time the First World War breaks out, with just a few isolated, mountainous or desert exceptions, places like Afghanistan or Central Arabia, almost the entire Muslim world had fallen under direct or indirect European control.
Which is just a staggering map to picture. But, military conquest is just lines on a map. What really fascinates me is the structural takeover you mentioned earlier. How exactly did the West impose that new operating system onto these societies?
Well, it happened by rewiring the foundational mechanics of daily life. And it starts with the economy.
Okay, how so?
So before the West arrived, you had the traditional bazaar economy, This was fluid, it was localized, and it was heavily based on personal trust, community ties, local credit networks.
Right, very human scale.
Exactly. But the West just bypasses that entirely. They introduce a global capitalist economy. They reoriented local agriculture to produce cash crops for European factories, pulling all these local farmers into a volatile global market.
Where prices were dictated in, like, in London or Paris.
Exactly.
So their local autonomy is suddenly linked to global supply chains that they have absolutely no control over.
Precisely. And I mean, it went all the way down to how people experienced time itself.
Wait, time.
Yeah. The text notes how the West built these new broad street cities right alongside the winding alleys of the old ones, and they installed public clocks.
Oh, wow.
Because traditional time was tied to the movement of the sun, right, and the fluid rhythm of the 5 daily prayers.
Right.
But the public clock demands this rigid, precise synchronization that's required by industrial labor and train schedules. It's literally a complete reordering of reality.
That is so invasive, which I guess culminates in what the source calls the most disruptive export of all, right? The modern state.
Oh, absolutely. The modern state is the ultimate top-down software. Traditional Muslim societies were organized around, communal solidarities, extended families, tribal loyalties, religious institutions.
Right. Authority was super decentralized.
Very much so. But the modern Western administrative state, it demands a massive bureaucracy that reaches into the daily life of every single citizen.
It wants data.
Yes, it demands taxation, conscription, standardization, but above all, it demands that your primary overarching loyalty be to the state itself. Not to your local community, and certainly not to a transnational religious identity.
So, I mean, just imagine your entire societal structure. How you work, how you learn, what laws you follow, how you measure time. Imagine all of that being dismantled and entirely re-engineered by a foreign bureaucracy in just like 2 or 3 generations.
It's almost impossible to fully grasp.
Yeah, and it's so easy to look at that staggering level of disruption and just assume the Muslim world was a passive victim, right? Just totally flattened by the Western steamroller.
But the text makes it very clear that this is a historical illusion.
Right.
Because while all that external Western pressure was building, there was this massive internal renovation happening in the basement.
The internal fire.
Exactly. This brings us to the second force, the internal Islamic revival. And the timeline is critical here because the roots of this revival were established long before Napoleon ever arrived in Egypt.
Wait, so if this internal fire wasn't a reaction to the West, what sparked it?
It was a movement for deep inner renewal. It was driven by a perceived moral decay within the Muslim community itself.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, the text describes a massive fundamental shift in the balance of Muslim piety. For centuries, there was this heavy influence from Sufism that fostered what we can call otherworldly piety, which is all about mysticism, the contemplation of God's divine mysteries, seeking spiritual enlightenment, focusing heavily on the afterlife.
But the revivalists pushed a hard pivot toward this worldly piety, right?
They did. This worldly piety argues that a Muslim's primary duty is not just to sit back and contemplate the divine, but to actively work to construct a just moral society right here on Earth.
That's a huge shift.
It really is. It was a rigorous demand for personal responsibility. The revivalists aggressively rejected the traditional practice of, relying on Sufi saints or holy men to intercede with God on behalf of the average believer.
And the source traces this network back to the 18th century. You have these pre-modern networks of scholars sitting in Medina, exchanging ideas, and then traveling back to places like India or North Africa to spread these strict reformist concepts.
Right.
You also have that really famous 1744 alliance in the Arabian Peninsula between the religious reformer Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab and the Saudi tribal family.
Yes, exactly.
Which created an incredibly powerful political and military engine for a very strict, purifying interpretation of this reform.
It did. And, to fuel this new activist mindset, the movement had to democratize access to the religion.
Right, because previously it was super restricted.
Exactly. For a long time, the traditional religious scholars, the ulama, had maintained a monopoly on religious authority. They were the gatekeepers of the texts, partly because manuscripts were rare.
Yeah, and they required elite training to even interpret them.
Right. So unsurprisingly, they had initially resisted the printing press.
But by the 19th century, that resistance just breaks down, and Muslim elites embrace print with vigor. They start doing something truly revolutionary. They start translating the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet into local vernacular languages like Urdu.
And that changes the entire power dynamic. Suddenly, everyday people could read the foundational texts for themselves, completely bypassing the scholars entirely.
Wow.
It empowered the individual believer, and it gave rise to this incredible concept highlighted in the source called the Caliphate of Man.
The Caliphate of Man.
Yes, it's the theological idea that every individual human being is God's vice-regent on earth, carrying a personal responsibility to uphold divine law.
Wait, so we connect this to the bigger picture. This revival was like the Protestant Reformation in Christianity.
It's exactly like that. The historical parallel is striking, and the source draws a direct line between this Islamic revival and the Protestant Reformation in Europe.
Because it's all about bypassing the middlemen.
Exactly. When Martin Luther translated the Bible into German and utilized the Gutenberg press, he broke the monopoly of the Catholic priesthood. He emphasized literacy, direct study of the original sources, intense personal responsibility.
Yeah.
And the leaders of the Islamic revival were doing the exact same thing to the traditional ulama and Sufi masters. In fact, major 19th century figures like Jamal al-Din al-Afghani explicitly admired European Protestants for ignoring their priests, and he essentially cast himself as a sort of Muslim Luther.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because now we have these two massive forces built up. An unstoppable force of Western imperial domination, armed with the modern state and global capitalism, inevitably crashing head-on into an immovable object of fiery grassroots Islamic revival that demands personal action and a just society.
And the resulting collision produces the psychological and political explosions that fundamentally shape the world we navigate today.
And it's worth pausing here just to note for you listening that some of the historical reactions we are about to look at involve incredibly intense, politically charged rhetoric.
Definitely.
And we aren't here to endorse these viewpoints or take sides on the geopolitics. We're just impartially unpacking the historical sentiments exactly as they are detailed in Robinson's text so we can understand the raw psychology of this era.
Right, because understanding that psychological progression is absolutely vital, because the initial reaction to Western dominance wasn't necessarily immediate violence. It was often this profound, heartbreaking nostalgia for a lost golden age.
Right.
The text highlights this famous 19th century poem by Altaf Hussein Hali, which is an elegy mourning the decline of Islam. He writes beautifully about seeing the footprints on the sands of India that merely suggest a graceful caravan once passed this way.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it is a deep, melancholic mourning for a civilization that felt it had just lost its place in history.
But nostalgia has a shelf life. As we move through the 20th century, the power of the West, and eventually the United States taking over as the global hegemon, that power becomes increasingly entrenched and visible in the daily lives of Muslims. So that melancholic mourning curdles into a very specific kind of rage.
It does. It turns into a furious resentment of perceived bullying, hypocrisy, and systemic injustice. And the text provides historical quotes that vividly illustrate this emotional shift.
Yeah, like the one from 1964.
Exactly. In 1964, Ayatollah Khomeini delivered a speech expressing absolute fury over the Iranian parliament, granting American citizens extraterritorial rights in Iran.
Okay, for those of us who aren't international law experts, what exactly do extraterritorial rights mean in practice, and why did it cause such a visceral reaction?
So it meant that American military personnel and their dependents who were living in Iran were literally immune to local Iranian laws and courts.
Wait, immune?
Yes. If an American committed crime against an Iranian, they could only be tried by the American military, not the local justice system.
Oh, wow.
It creates this humiliating two-tiered society where the locals are legally subordinate in their own country.
I mean, that really explains the intensity of Khomeini's rhetoric.
Huh.
The text notes he stated, this policy had reduced the Iranian people to a level lower than that of an American dog.
Exactly. That is the raw humiliation the text asks us to observe. And decades later, the source points to Osama bin Laden in 1998, who intentionally tapped into ancient crusader imagery to frame his declaration of war.
Right.
He was explicitly linking modern American geopolitical actions in the Middle East to centuries-old religious conflicts, specifically to mobilize that deep-seated resentment.
And Robinson actually points out a really striking historical parallel regarding that resentment. He notes that a historian might look at the Anglo-American invasion of Iraq in 2003 and reflect that roughly 205 years after the French marched into Cairo claiming they were bringing enlightenment and liberation, the West was essentially playing the exact same game in Baghdad, using military force to insert itself into a major Muslim capital under the banner of bringing freedom.
That is the enduring historical perspective of the colonized. And that deep resentment demanded a political solution.
Right, which was tricky.
Very. Initially, Muslim rulers and elites tried something called Islamic modernism. They tried to artificially blend Islamic values with Western science and Enlightenment philosophy.
But that didn't really take off, did it?
No, it was far too elite. It didn't speak to the struggles of the masses.
And as these countries slowly gained independence in the 20th century, the new local leaders usually pushed secular nationalism. You have figures like Ataturk in Turkey or the Ba'athist regimes in Syria and Iraq.
Right.
They tried to push Islam entirely into the private sphere and build modern states based purely on ethnic or linguistic identity.
But those secular nationalist states largely failed. They became autocratic, they failed to deliver on their economic promises of prosperity, and most importantly, they couldn't satisfy the deep psychological and cultural needs of their populations.
Right, so a massive ideological vacuum opens up.
Exactly.
And who stepped into that vacuum? Because it wasn't the traditional religious scholars, the ulama.
No, the traditional scholars had been heavily sidelined by the modern state's control of education and law. The people who stepped into the vacuum and took over the revival movement were the laymen.
This is a wild historical pivot, Liebman.
Yes, it is the defining pivot of modern political Islam, or Islamism. The founders and leaders of these movements were deeply shaped by Western-style educations.
Wow, really?
Yeah. Hassan al-Banna, who founded the incredibly influential Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in 1928, was a schoolteacher. Sayyid Abu al-Maududi, who founded the Jama'at-e-Islami in South Asia, was a journalist.
Okay.
As you look through the 20th century, the leadership of these Islamist movements is heavily populated by doctors, university professors, and engineers.
So the very tools the West introduced, modern education, print, global communication, were exactly what these new lay leaders used to organize the resistance against the West.
It is the ultimate historical irony. The West required a modern, educated, middle-class citizen to run its global system. But those exact citizens used their literacy, their systems thinking, and their modern media savvy to push back.
They flipped the script.
They did. They looked at the modern, totalizing state the West had introduced. And they didn't reject the machinery. They decided they wanted to run the machinery, but heavily subordinate it to the guidance of Islamic law.
That collision between the Western state apparatus and the internal lay-led revival has just been grinding on for 200 years.
Yeah.
And if we look at the physical map and demographic reality of the Islamic world today as a result of that history, it is entirely transformed from what it was in 1800.
Completely transformed. When Western media discusses the Islamic world, we are heavily conditioned to immediately picture the Arab Middle East. But the source points out a massive defining geographic shift. Today, for the first time in history, more Muslims live east of the Hindu Kush Mountains than to the west of them.
Which means South Asia, Malaysia, and Indonesia are the new demographic heavyweights.
Yes.
And why that matters so much today is that they aren't just massive populations. They are fundamentally distinct centers of Islamic thought, organization, and political reality.
They really are. The text points to organizations like the Tabligh Jamaat.
We hear that name, but how does it actually operate?
So it translates roughly to the Society for Spreading Faith. It started in India in the 1920s as a grassroots, strictly apolitical movement.
Okay, apolitical.
Right. Instead of trying to capture the state, it focuses on inner renewal, sending small groups of laymen door to door, traveling the world to remind everyday Muslims of their basic religious duties.
Wow.
And because of that decentralized grassroots approach, it is now arguably the most widely followed Islamic movement in the world. Millions of adherents globally, operating entirely outside the fraught politics of the Middle East.
And when you look further east to places like Indonesia and Malaysia, you see this immense Islamic demographic that is heavily intertwined with democratic development and civic institutions, creating a reality that directly counters the autocratic narratives often associated with the Middle East.
It just proves that global Islam in the modern era is incredibly diverse and deeply engaged with different political systems. And another profound paradigm shift the text highlights in this modern era is the changing public role of women.
Yeah, this section of the text is really striking because women have essentially been used as the primary battleground for state identity throughout this entire collision.
Definitely.
When secular dictators like Ataturk in Turkey or the Shah in Iran wanted to signal to the world how modern and Western their states were, they violently forced women to unveil in public.
And conversely, when Islamist movements pushed back and seized power, such as during the 1979 Iranian Revolution or the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan, they violently forced women back into the veil to prove their cultural authenticity and rejection of the West.
Right.
Women's bodies were constantly regulated to broadcast the ideological stance of the men running the state.
But despite being constantly pushed and pulled by those patriarchal state policies, the actual public role and visibility of women has grown massively.
It has.
The source provides an incredible statistic to illustrate this. In the 14 centuries of Islamic history prior to the modern era, there were really only 2 female rulers of major states.
Shajar al-Dur in 13th century Egypt and Sultana Radia in 13th century Delhi.
Right, just those 2. But just since the 1980s, the modern political reality has produced 4. You have Khalida Zia in Bangladesh, Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan, Tansu Çiller in Turkey, and Sukarnoputri Megawati in Indonesia.
It is a massive shift in the mechanics of power, and it leads us to one final immense demographic irony outlined in the text.
Oh, the diaspora.
Yes. The ultimate result of the West expanding outward, structurally dominating the Muslim world and triggering this massive economic and political upheaval is that the Muslim world eventually migrated to the West.
Millions of Muslims migrating to Europe and North America. Some for economic opportunity, sure, but many fleeing the exact political and structural upheavals caused by this 2-century collision.
Which means that for the West today, interacting with Islam is no longer just a matter of foreign policy or distant colonial administration. It is deeply embedded domestic policy. The modern Islamic experience is actively being navigated in the suburbs of Paris, the neighborhoods of London, and the communities of Dearborn, Michigan.
Where Muslims are figuring out how to maintain their faith as minorities within secular Western legal frameworks.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean? To synthesize all of this, what Francis Robinson is really proving in this history is that the popular political catchphrase of a clash of civilizations is fundamentally a myth.
It is a myth because it implies 2 isolated, static worlds crashing into each other in a vacuum.
Right.
The reality is co-creation. Over the last 2 centuries, the West and the Islamic world have intimately, painfully, and continuously shaped each other. The West forced a massive structural rewrite of Muslim societies, and the internal Islamic revival dictated exactly how Muslims would survive, adapt, and assert their identity within that modern reality.
The 2 architectures are just completely intertwined. And for you listening, this dynamic, this relentless machinery of Western globalization, clashing with a deep internal drive for authentic grassroots identity, is the invisible context for almost every geopolitical headline you read today.
It really is.
It explains the shifting borders, the democratic experiments in Asia, the ongoing culture wars.
You simply cannot separate the headlines from the history of these 2 forces.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We've spent this time exploring how the last 200 years were entirely defined by the Muslim world reacting to Western hegemony. But look at the trajectory of the world today. We are entering a 21st century where Western dominance is no longer a guaranteed absolute.
Right.
And the center of global economic and political power is rapidly shifting eastward. If the Muslim world has spent 2 centuries adapting its ancient, communal operating system to survive the West's mandatory software update, what happens to that internal renovation project when the West is no longer the only giant in the room?
Yeah.
How does the global Islamic community redefine its future when the very concept of Western dominance begins to fade? Keep questioning the narratives you are handed, and we will see you next time on The Deep Dive.